this week, your Photoshop project is going to be dealing with colorization of black and white photos. And that's a thing that Photoshop really excels at. And a couple reasons I'm doing this assignment is it's a good way to help you understand a couple of key features of Photoshop, to get some more control over the application, and also to alleviate some of the creative pressure for you to come up with something. It's a really technical exercise, and it's going to make you really focus on looking at the work you're doing, and paying attention to things like color and detail, and hopefully it gets you in the mindset of really zoning in on a project and just really working on the minutiae of the project, and making sure that you're paying really close attention to detail and working in a very detailed way, but you're not having to rack your brain trying to come up with some brilliant new creative idea. There's a lot of creativity and artistry to this project, but it's more based on you really learning how to look at things. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to pick a black and white photo. And so I had you go back and look for some websites that had copyright-free images. You can go back and do that, and grab a black and white photo from there. You can do a portrait, or you can do like if there's a photograph of a landscape in black and white, or it's maybe more of a kind of a slice of life photo, an event, something in black and white. You can pick that. A portrait's probably the easiest thing to start with, just because it limits the number of different items you're going to have to colorize. If you're going to do like a landscape, you've got all kinds of different trees and grass and rocks and sky and a lot of different things, and maybe even buildings. With a portrait, it's basically learning how to really build a skin tone and do the hair and maybe the clothes, and kind of playing around with those things. So by limiting a little bit, you'll make it a little bit easier on yourself. So if you can find a black and white portrait of someone, it can be just anyone basically. And I'm going to open this up and let you even do like black and white photos of celebrities. It can be a black and white photo of a family member, a black and white photo of yourself. Like I say, a celebrity. What I like to do is I like to go through and look at old vintage mugshots. I know that's really weird, but these are mugshots from the early 1900s, and there's just a lot of character in these people's faces and their clothes, and you scroll through and you just get a whole lot of character, and there's like story behind that. So that's something I like to just kind of play with, and these are really great portraits, even though they're mugshots. So you might search vintage mugshots and find some that you would maybe pull from and want to use. And I'm not going to worry so much about copyright restrictions on this, because this is a technical exercise for a class. It's not something you're going to be pushing off as your own creative work. So with it being an educational project, we've got some leeway on copyright. Like I said, if you want to do a celebrity, maybe you can find a black and white photo of an old celebrity from the 40s or 30s or 50s or whatever. You could also do a portrait of a current celebrity. You might not be able to find a black and white photo of them, but you can take a photo and make it black and white in Photoshop. Now this is a mugshot that's in black and white, so I'm going to start with that. And let's say I've got another color image. This one of Zoe Saldana, the actress who plays Gamora in the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. So maybe you want to do a colorized photo of her. So I find a good high quality image of her, and I need to make that black and white. The way you can turn, a couple ways you can turn Photoshop file black and white. The way we're going to do it is, when you open a file, it'll tell you up here if it's RGB, that means it's a color image. If it's black and white or grayscale, it'll say grayscale or B&W up here. So if it says RGB, what you want to do is you want to remove all the color from that. Now, because we're going to be adding color back too, we need to stay in RGB mode. So the best way to remove the color is to go to the image menu and go to adjustments and go to hue and saturation. And when you do that, you go to the saturation slider and make sure this little preview button is clicked. Saturation will increase the color saturation or decrease it completely and remove all the color. So that's the way, if you're going to do like a contemporary portrait of someone, you would go in and take all that color out that way. Okay? So now back to our black and white photo. Is once you've got the photo, the first thing I'd like you to do is crop the image to a 4x5 by 300 pixel per inch image. Okay, now up here on your toolbar, you want to look for this tool. This is the cropping tool. When you click that, it allows you to recrop your image in a specified size. Up here in the top, you'll see all this stuff will change depending on what tool you have. If you click here, you get some presets. You can set an exact width and height and resolution. And the resolution determines how much detail is in your photo. So the higher this resolution number is, the more detail your photo will have. What I'd like you to do is go ahead and pick 4 by 5 inches for 300 dpi and make your image fit into that. So we'll select that, and you'll get this box. And you grab these corners, and what it does, it resizes the box, and then you'll fit your image inside that box. So I'm going to go ahead and come in close on this and crop it. Now again, depending on the image you pick, this crop may be a little weird. Again, I'm looking for your technique in your colorization here more than anything. So that's what's going to matter the most, more so than composition or everything else. So I like this little thing here. I don't mind that. I don't mind that he's off center here. So I'll get that crop, and then if I double click, what it does is it removes the rest of the image outside that box and scales it up to an image size of 4 inches by 5 inches by 300 pixels per inch. Okay, and that gives me a lot of info to go with. Okay, it's a good size photo. So now I've got my layers palette open. I want to make sure I have my layers palette for this whole project. And you'll see when you bring the image in, it's a background image. So you should have just one layer. It should say background. It should be the actual picture you're working on. And what we want to do is we want to create new layers that contain all the new color we're going to add into these images. So first thing I'm going to do is create a new layer by clicking here at this little bottom icon with the plus sign. That creates a new layer. It calls it layer 1. Now what I like to do is select this here, click on that, or double click on the name, and instead of layer 1, I'll make this is going to be like the basic flesh color, so I'm going to call this base flesh. That way I'm going to have more and more of these layers, so I want to make sure that it's easy to know what these different layers are. Now the next thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and colorize this. So I want to try to get as natural a skin tone as I can. Now I might have this idea in my head what that looks like, but what's really helpful is for you to go online and download some different portraits of people. And this is really just as a visual reference, okay? Because when you think about flesh tone, we all kind of think about flesh as a color, but really it's made up of lots of colors. You've got in this guy here, you'll see that his flesh tone is made up of lots of reds here and some peaches, and in his 5 o'clock shadow he's got some gray blues in here, and there's some tans and yellows up here, so, and there's some blues in these shadows, right? So really flesh tone is made up of a lot of different colors. Same with hair. So what you'll want to do is just have a good reference so you've got a good idea of how to approach this. Now this is a different photo under different lighting conditions, so that changes what colors those would be. But if you look in here in the shadows, you'll see some grays and blues. All right, this is a little more muted, not as many reds. Now this photo here, I picked this one because it seems to have the lighting closest to the photo I'm trying to colorize. So I try to find something, and again, it's from the front. The lighting's pretty even. So I'm going to use this as my reference image. And then I'm going to look in, we'll see like in the ears, up at the edges of the ears, it's a little more red, and it goes to this lighter peachy color. It's darker reds in here. There's some blues in the shadows. So I like to have something just to kind of reference. There's reds in the lips. But really start paying attention to photos and all the different colors that make up this skin color. Okay? So have this somewhere handy where you can see that as you're working. I've got another screen that you can't see, so it's going to be there for me. All right, now back to our photo. I've got this new base color flesh. So what I want to do is I want to think about a color, and I should have my color palette here where I can drag, and where I see this little circle, that's the color it's going to pick, and it's going to show up in this box. So let's start with, because we're kind of conditioned to start with this peachy pink color as flesh. So we'll start with that as a base. Now I'm going to get one of my brushes, my brush tool here on the tool palette. It's brush tool or B on your key command. I'm going to click it, and I'm going to zoom up, and do not be afraid to zoom up when you're working. A lot of students, for whatever reason, feel like they have to work zoomed out. This is something you really want to zoom in on. The first thing I'm going to do is, with my base flesh layer selected, and that means it's highlighted in gray, I'm going to get my brush, and what I want to do is right click on my mouse. That'll call up a little box here where I can set some parameters. Set a size of the brush, top. Okay, you can see the outline of the brush on screen. It gets bigger or smaller. And I can set the hardness of the brush. What that does is, if you've got the hardness all the way to the left, it means it's got a very soft edge on it. If I paint a stroke with that, actually something you also want to check up at the top, when you switch to the brush, you've got more brush settings. The opacity, set that to 100. That means you're putting down a solid stroke of color. So with that soft brush setting, see I get this fuzzy edge? Okay, and I want that sometimes. Now if I go into the eye and paint over it, what happens is it starts to bleed over onto the eyeball, and I lose some of the crispness of that. So instead of a soft brush there, in that case I would right click and select a hard brush, and again zoom up and go in and try to just kind of paint over these details. Now it looks terrible because what we're doing is we're going in and painting over this, and we're just getting this big flat color, right? But as a start, that's what I want to do. I want to kind of go in and get these shapes and kind of mask out a big flat area of color for where the skin's going to be. Okay, and I'm not going to get this down perfect because honestly, we could spend a lot of time doing this, and I don't want to make y'all watch me do the whole thing, right? And try to get in and get all these little minute details. But you can go in and you can get a really great edge just by adjusting your size and the hardness of the brush. And so you can get a really finely tuned edge here. And then what I'll do is, just to speed things up, I'll just do a part of the face. And again, I'm right clicking to call this dialog box up here, or if you don't have a right click mouse button, you can hold down the control key and left click, or click your mouse, and it'll come up too. Oops. Now I have accidentally picked a color that's not the one I wanted to use. So I want to get back to this exact color. Now if I go in here and try to drag and select over here, I'm never going to get that exact color. What I can do is, over here in my tool palette, there is an eyedropper tool. and it is located right here. Here at the top. Here is the key command for that. So the letter I on your keyboard will call up the eyedropper tool. It's got some other tools underneath it, but you want the eyedropper. If I select eyedropper and click here, it loads that color back in my brush. So I can go to my brush, and I can just quickly go in and kind of get some of these areas. All right. So let's call that almost good for now. Now that looks terrible, right? Because we're not blending with the photo underneath. What you want to do to blend this with your photo is on your layers. You have a little pop-up button, drop-down bar here. These are called blending modes. What this does, it changes the way this layer interacts with the layer directly underneath. So if I go in and click darken, okay, it changes the way those two layers blend together. So multiply, and with darken, it darkens any pixel that's lighter than the one I just painted, which makes no sense, but that's the way it works. And to try to explain how all these works is really awkward and difficult. So the best thing to do is just scroll through each one of them and see how it affects the layer underneath. And what I'm looking for is one that blends the color I've added with the photo underneath in a way that seems natural, right? Where the shadows start to blend in too. Okay, like some of these are really blasted out, and some of these are just way too dark, right? So I like, for this first one, we'll start with color. Now we may change this later as we work more. Okay. And I'm going to go back to my brush, and I see that there's a little bit there that I needed to get. And I can go back in and see I've got a little bit here that I need to erase. So I can go to my eraser tool, which is the letter E on your keyboard here. And I can do the same thing and change its brush size, change the hardness, and go in and erase bits of that. It also has opacity. So if I go ahead and just make that 100% opaque, that's going to take out that. And because we're working in layers, nothing is destructive. We can come back, and I'm not going to mess up this background color underneath, right? So what this really looks like is that. And if you ever need to get your color back, turn this off, and this will give you the actual color. And then you can get the eyedropper to grab it. All right, now what I want to do is I picked this color to start with. It's way too orange and peachy. Now, something I can do, and this is one of those things that's really important in Photoshop that you understand, is you can change this entire layer, change the color of that layer. A couple ways to do it. The way I'm going to show you is a way that does it in a non-destructive manner, which means that you can change it back. If you don't like what you've done later on, you can go back and change it back to this color. So in Photoshop, you've got all these adjustments here that you can make to your images. You can go to hue and saturation and change color this way, right? Now when you do that, what happens is it changes all those pixels, and then if you get too far, you can't go back. So all these adjustments are great ways to change brightness, contrast levels, colors, and all that stuff. But let's say you want to change this back later, or change this color again, or get back to the original. What you can do is also in Photoshop, get the layer you've created the color on. You go to the layer menu and do a new adjustment layer. And these are the same adjustments that you saw here. What happens is they can be made specific to a layer, which is the layer you've got selected. So I'm going to go to hue and saturation. Now when I get my pop-up, I can name it. So I could call this base, flesh, hue, and saturation. Now, if I don't do anything else and leave this unchecked, it will affect every layer underneath it. But if I click this button, this set of saturation adjustments is only going to apply to the layer that I've got selected. And you'll see that come in handy later. Okay, so I've got my adjustment layer. It shows up. See how it's indented here? That means it's connected and pointing to this layer. That means it's connected only to the layer underneath it. Now, what I want to do is to make a hue and saturation adjustment. I want to double click the layer, and in your properties palette right here, you'll see those controls come up. Okay. And if your properties palette isn't showing up, you can go to Windows and go to Properties. So let's turn it off. So let's say I want to see that and double click, it'll show up somewhere over here on the right, most likely. Now what I can do is, okay, this is way too saturated. I can go in and pull the saturation down. Okay, and I'm trying to think of what this looks like naturally, and again, trying to keep an eye on my reference photo. Okay, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to build this over a couple layers. And so I can adjust the hue, which changes the color temperature. So instead of so peachy, we could go a little more red, a little more yellow. That looks a little more natural. Still a long way to go. I can change the darkness and the lightness here. Change the saturation back up. All right, so let's leave it at that for now. And that's kind of a good pinkish skin color for a base. And then I can go back through and select my base layer again, and I can still go in, and now maybe I can use a different adjustment layer. Maybe one of them works better. Some of them work even worse now, but that's okay. So we'll stick with color. All right. So what I would do, I would go in and I could get my brush tool, and still with that same color still selected here, the original color, I can brush and it will turn it to this new color I've picked. So I can go in and do more here. Okay, and then if I don't like this, I can always go back, double click here again on this layer, and adjust it again. Or if I really don't like it, I can turn it off and see where it was. Okay, so let's go with this. Now the next thing I want to do is, okay, let's say we get a good base color down here. And that would be something like this. Okay. Now what I want to think about is the shadows. Okay. Now I know from looking at a lot of photos and a lot of references, I know that you often get a lot of purples and blues in the shadow areas of a photo. And I can see that this color is a little bit off from what I did in the other part of the demo. So I might adjust that a little bit. Again, by having these layers, these adjustment layers, I can come back and change this stuff at any time and not ruin anything. So now I want to do shadows. I like to keep the shadows on a separate layer from everything else. So what I want to do is create a new layer. So click off here so there's no layer anywhere. Selected. Hit the plus icon down here. It adds a new layer on top of these others. Right now I want to go in and let's say pick a blue or maybe something a little more purpley here. All right, so let's do that. Now I know that this is going to be too much to get started. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and get my brush and do a small brush and do a soft edge. Now this is really heavy. What I like to do is when I'm starting to add these details is instead of using a solid color stroke, go in and change the opacity up here for this brush. And I like to kind of build that stuff up. Now this still looks like he's wearing makeup, right? And that's okay. But I'm looking at where the shadows are in the photo. Now you'll see that it starts to overlap here and create an overlap. So maybe I want to go back and go down a little bit. I can undo, undo, undo. And maybe I want to go back with a lower opacity. And this is pretty subtle stuff here, right? And I'm trying to find the darkest shadows and maybe just paint those. Okay, and these are going to be the shadows in the eye socket. Be shadows around the nostrils. And like try to find the darkest shadows on the face, right? And again, this is going to test your ability to really pay attention to detail. Like here's some stuff in the ear, and I can see the subtle changes, and you'll get used to looking for those subtle changes in color. Okay, now this looks like somebody has black design. That's not the look we're going for. We want something that really mimics like a natural shadow. But I can see the colors there, and I'm starting to fill in and give it a little more depth in color-wise. Then what I want to do is test out my layer mode for this layer. And I can click here, double click, and call this Shadows 1, because I might do a Shadows 2 later. And then I can change, again, the way these start to interact with the layers underneath. And I'm looking for something that looks a little more natural. Now, saturation is a good version, and hue is a good option. So what you can do is take a look at how it interacts with the lightness and the darkness of the color underneath. That's really what you want to pay attention. Some of them blend, like this blends terribly. This is a really subtle blend. That's a good blend as far as like a different range of value that's picking up, but it's a little harsh. But let's start with that one. And then I can change the opacity of that and start to blend that in. Okay? And you might want to zoom out and see how that starts to look. It still looks really purpley, but it's a good value shift. Okay, and again, if I turn it off, it's subtle, but you can see how that's starting to bring out the depth and starting to feel a little more realistic now. Right? But something I can do is, I really don't like that purple. So with this shadow layer selected, highlighted in gray, click on it to do that. I go to Layer and go to New Adjustment Layer and go to Hue and Saturation. And again, I can call this Shadow Hue and Saturation. And use Previous Layer to create a clipping mask. This is what makes it only affect the layer it's directly above. So again, you can see this down arrow pointing to this layer. That means that's the only layer it's going to affect. And I can double click and I can start to change the color here and try to get something a little more natural. And again, I'm going to zoom out and try a couple different things. And what's going to happen is I'm going to build the depth over time. Okay. But so that's pretty good for now. We get some good depth. We get some good additional color beyond this original orange. Real quickly, let's go ahead and do, and this is by no means finished. Okay, but this is kind of the technique I want you to kind of get a handle on. Let's do another new layer. First, we click down here in this area to deselect all layers. Create a new layer. I'm going to get a nice red for the lips. And we'll start with this, red, like he's wearing really red lipstick is what this is going to look like, and that's fine. And again, I'm trying to, okay, I've got a low opacity. Let's go ahead and go with a full solid opacity. Okay, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to get a harder edge on my brush. And this looks really cartoony, and that's okay. Again, this is a process that takes a good while to build up on and build up over. So that looks pretty awful. And when I go and change it to a different layer mode, it still looks pretty awful. But I expect that. So let's see if there's anything that blends in where it picks up those shadows and blends in pretty good. This one does a good job. Color Burn does a good job of colorizing the shadow areas and helping pull that detail through. Like this one like loses all that really good detail in the shadows. That one, it's a little weird because of the way the highlights kind of colorize. So for right now, I'm going to go with multiply. Then I'm going to drag my opacity down a lot. If I zoom out, I mean, that looks like he just put on some lipstick, and that's not the look we're going for. We're going for something a little more natural. Part of the problem is the hardness of the edge around the lips. So we want to adjust that. I'm going to zoom in. And a couple ways I could do this. There is over here on the left. If you find this tool, you've got the smudge tool and you've got a blur tool. You'll see one of these three to start with. You'll probably see the blur tool to start. And what that does is it will go in and blur an edge. So if I turn off everything else where you're just seeing that edge, I can go in and make that edge a little bit fuzzier. And again, I can change the strength up here so it's really blurs it a lot. And I can blur it in here. So we can soften that edge up and maybe it won't look so weird. Okay, so the more I soften that, it blends it in a little bit better. Something else I can do is get the same place, the smudge tool. And let's see, with its settings all the way up, with the strength all the way up, what happens is you can just smudge it all over the place, which we don't want. What we'll do is do a lower strength, turn this back on, and maybe I'm just going to smudge it in really subtle ways here. So it's not so much like I've gone in and brushed that. And I'm just doing really quick little clicks and drags to smudge that out a little bit. And then what I might even do is get my eraser tool, again E on your keyboard, change its opacity, lower, and give it a softer edge by dragging the hardness here, and maybe a larger size, and going in and click in and erasing at a lower opacity on this edge to help blend that some more. And again, this is one of those things you just get better at the more you do it. Okay, so that's a little better. It's still real harsh here, so let's try to soften that up a little bit. I'll get the smudge tool again and maybe smudge that out a little bit. So hopefully you can see how that's softening up that edge. And again, we can go in and adjust the opacity now. Okay, and that's starting to look more natural now and not as much as like he's wearing a bunch of makeup. Again, you can at this point go in and try some different channels here. Colors, not too bad, but I think I'll stick with multiply and just adjust the opacity on that layer. All right, now that's still a little bit of a weird color, still pretty makeup-y. So I'll select this layer, do a new adjustment layer, hue and saturation, use the previous layer, and my properties palette is open, so these controls become available immediately. And so if I change my saturation, I get something there that looks a lot more natural. So I change it to a darker, change the lightness a little bit to the left. Maybe pump that up a little bit. Again, looking at this photo, all right, that's a pretty harsh difference between the color of his lips and the color of the rest of his face, but it doesn't look like makeup. So really, this is one of those eyeball things where you have to kind of really scrutinize your references and also make some creative decisions as to what looks good for this photo. Like a photo in this time period with this type of photography will have a different color characteristic than something else, than like a photo taken with your iPhone. So you want it to look good, but also feel like it's got all those different colors that make up a flesh tone. And then if you don't like it, you can go ahead and turn the flare off and see. Again, it's fairly subtle, but that looks pretty good. All right, so eventually what happens is you continue to work with the layers to create more and more detail. And so here's a version of it where, again, I've got the skin tone, the base skin tone. And then I go in and adjust that. The next thing I do is a shadow layer. Right? And then I've got a layer of color over the top of everything. And what that looks like is this. Because skin tone has some more oranges, I went in and found some areas where I thought that, you know, it could use a little more of that orange color. Now that's way too much, right? So I'll select it and then I'll back down to something a little more subtle. And maybe try a different layer and see if we get something that looks more natural. And then I've adjusted that. Let's go back to saturation hue. That's pretty good there. And then I've got a layer of pinks to get, like in my photo, there's a lot of pink in the X around the edge of the ear and in the nose, and so I've got a layer that looks like, well, it's really, really light. I've got the light opacity turned down. There's what it looks like. It's got a lot of pinks and reds. I'm using a linear light for the layer mode, and what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to play around with those layer modes. They make a big difference. But this was at like 23, and then linear light I think was the best one, so let's select that. And then I still do an adjustment layer on top of that. I can go in and tweak it. Then I've got, again, the layer for the lips. I've got a really subtle layer here, so you can see it here. To add a little bit of color into some of those shadows, I use color burn and just play around. And then I added a layer for his 5 o'clock shadow that looks like that. But it's set at a really, it's set for the soft light. But change these, it starts to really look like a drawn on beard. Like some of these look awful, right? But that's okay. And then I can adjust that down. And then I can adjust its color with a layer mask. And so then you would continue on and on and on until you get the face where you want it, the eyes and the hair and the clothes, right? And so there's a lot of work to do. Now, I'm not looking for you to be able to do something that looks perfectly colorized like you would never know it was not a color photo. But I want to see some of this experimentation, and so you're trying to get this range of color in here. Okay. And so back to the Zoe, same thing with the Zoe Saldana photo. Say you like Gamora, so maybe you want to try to recreate that character's look. Find a photo of her, get a photo reference of that. Okay. And see how close you can come to reproducing that. Or maybe you could take another celebrity and see what they would look like in the role instead of her, right? So what we've got is, there's my reference. I'll put it off to the side. For her, I've done the same thing. I did a layer of just color here. And so with the opacity normal, there's what that looked like to start with. Again, I didn't do the lips because her lips on the photo are a little bit different shade. They're more blue-green. There's some makeup around the eye, so I left the spot open for that. But what I want to do is go back to my vivid light is the mode I used, and with an opacity of 45, that gave me a pretty good starting point. And then I use my hue and saturation layer to adjust the color a little bit. And then what you might do is do a lip layer here, and an eye layer here. And you know, you would do the hair kind of the same way. Do layers for the hair, and you might do a layer for the purple in her hair, because she's got purple and golds and browns and blacks in her hair, right? So you might have to come up with a couple layers or do it all on one layer. Again, play around and see what you can figure out. And then this is a layer here of real subtle blues. You can barely see them. They're real light. But they do make a really subtle difference in giving some depth to the image. Okay? So that's the assignment, and that's kind of the workflow I would use. I'm going to have some links to other people doing this, and to, in particular, an artist who is extremely skilled at photo colorization. That's really all she does now, and her work is amazing, and it looks like an actual color photo, not something that's been colorized. But I want you, again, to just take the time to really experiment and work on learning the subtleties of this. And you're really just using a couple of tools. You're using the brush tool, the eraser tool, and you're using layers and layer modes. Okay, that's not really that much, but if you can really master those tools, you can master Photoshop. Okay, and so that's, you know, a lot of these Photoshop assignments are meant to introduce you to those basic tools you have to learn. I'm not so concerned with you all creating individual works of art this semester to learn Photoshop. I want you to learn Photoshop. The artistry in your own design you'll work in later when you're more comfortable with Photoshop. But learning these tools and these techniques will translate to everything we'll do in Photoshop and everything you'll do in Photoshop from now on. If you can master this stuff here, you can master Photoshop. So that's why these exercises are so important, and it's so important that you really get into it and dive into it and invest yourself in these projects. I know they seem like projects, and some of them may seem like busy work, but they're not. Photoshop's an incredibly complicated piece of software, and this is what I found to be maybe the best way to get you all to feeling comfortable with it. So again, you can colorize, like if you've got an old family portrait in black and white of a grandparent, a great-grandparent, distant relative, you can colorize that. You can take a photo of a contemporary artist that you downloaded and turn it to black and white and then colorize that. If you do want to do something like this with the Gamora character, you can do that. You can see what your favorite character looks like as an alien. You know, I don't mind you doing that because that's something that actually happens in the entertainment industry. This is, something for this character would have been done in the development stage of this character. So this is, practical. It's an actual thing that might be a job for someone. All right, so if you have any questions, let me know or let Andy know. If you send me an email, I can answer you pretty much right away, or like within 24 hours. If you post it in the discussion, it might be a couple days, or I might miss it, honestly. So if you got a really urgent question, or if you want me to do another demo of something, if you're stuck somewhere, send me an email. Say, hey, Shay, can you do a quick demo of this? Because I can knock out a demo for you for like a lot of little individual questions pretty quickly. So I'll be happy to make a demo for you with a particular question and show you how to get past it, and then post that for everyone if you want. And then when you're done with your photo, what I want from you is two things. I want you to upload your original photo that you started from, and then when you're finished, go to File and Export as a JPEG, 100% quality, and this will be the image size that you cropped it to. Okay, and convert to sRGB. You can just leave this. You can leave all these other settings, but do it as a JPEG, 100% quality, and export that with obviously your name. So this would be Stanley. This is project 7? Whatever the project number is. And colorized. Okay, so upload the final, which is this, and then upload the original photo that you started from so I can see where you started. Okay, sorry it's such a long video, but hopefully you'll find it helpful. All right, just give me a shout with any questions. Thanks, y'all.